Ready when you are.
Solar storms, platforms, silicon-based life forms. All on this week's manual episode of I'll Explain Later, the Doctor Who podcast that just wants to feel human again. With your hosts John West
and Matt Needer. On tonight's programme, Sarah makes a digital discovery in a quarry and gets to make all the obvious puns, saving us the bother. Handy. Meanwhile, the Fourth Doctor wonders what he'll find on the planet Castria. Roke on, Tommy. We absorb the full force of the Hand of Fear. Hello, John.
Matt, how are you?
I'm very good, thanks. I'm very good. I'm liking the very Star Trek, Next Generation First Contact coded jumper you're wearing.
I hadn't really clocked that. It wasn't deliberate.
It's excellent. I like it.
I am missing the pin badge.
If any of our generous listeners or viewers would like
if either of you would like
make
to
a donation, if you've got a spare one lying around at home. Hello, listeners. Hello, viewers. Good to have you with us once again for another episode of I'll Explain Later and another conversation about Doctor Who.
That's right.
And this week we are talking about the Hand of Fear.
The Hand of Fear.
The Hand of Fear. Which is...
It does sound like a Naked Gun entry, doesn't it?
I was going to say, I mean, I sort of always really liked just what a sort of on-the-nose title it is, especially because it is about a spooky, disembodied hand. But anyway,
which is probably the most effective part of it. But yes.
Not to prejudice your thoughts.
No, not at all.
Go on, give us the numbers before you prejudice your thoughts even further.
So, The Hand of Fear. So this is season 14.
Yep.
And it was broadcast it's 4 episodes, so it was broadcast between the 2nd and the 23rd of October 1976, written by the Bristol Boys, Bob Baker, Dave Martin, directed by Lenny Mayne.
Yeah.
Script editor Robert Holmes, producer Philip Hinchcliffe, and music, of course, by Dudley Simpson.
The wonderful Dudley Simpson.
Yep. I think... that so obviously this is the Fourth Doctor, Sarah Jane.
Final Sarah Jane outing.
Indeed.
In the main run, anyway.
And it's a bit of a curiosity, this story, I feel.
Do you want to tell us what happens in it first?
Yes. So the Doctor and Sarah Jane, the TARDIS lands not in South Croydon, but in a quarry, which for once is meant to be genuinely a quarry in something of a...
I like that.
Yeah. I think that was quite a knowing... It felt like a knowing bit of...
It's a quarry that they actually blow up as well, which is very exciting.
Very exciting. And they're wandering through it with klaxons going, and they don't seem to clock that. There's an explosion, and they're sort of buried. Sarah Jane emerges from the rubble, having reached out and found a sort of stone hand with a ring on it. And that stone hand with a ring on it results from the attempted execution of a wannabe potentate from the planet. Thank you. From the planet Castria. Who's called Eldrad.
The number of times someone says Eldrad must live in this, John. You still had to check your notes to find the villain's name.
Eldrad. Anyway, so she grabs at this hand and then is sort of taken over by, and basically the hand, or the ring at least attached to it, and the hand. To cut a long story short, and it did feel quite long in parts, manages to persuade everybody to get this hand and this ring to a nuclear power station where the hand can absorb the radiation and regenerate with a view to regenerating, getting all powerful again, going back to the planet Castria and
taking over,
potentating once more. So yeah, and the Doctor and Sarah Jane. The interesting dynamic is that Eldrad is sort of set up as the villain. Then there's a section sort of in episode 3 in particular where there's a dramatic flex. Is Eldrad actually a villain or not? Turns out yes, he/she/it is. But there's a decent attempt at kind of throwing us off the scent there. Credit to the Bristol boys, I think, for that. And then they end up on the planet Castria, where Eldrad tries to take over, realizes that the planet has been deliberately left to die just in case he comes back. That's how much of an asshole he was.
Brutal.
I know. Right down to a sick burn video left for him. And then they trip him over the Doctor's scarf where he falls into a chasm in probably one of the lamest exits for a villain, but really he'd served his purpose by that point, Eldrad, I think. I don't know much about the reputation of this. I did a little bit of digging.
Yep.
It seems to be broadly considered mediocre.
Mm-hmm.
Neither an utter disaster or sort of flagrantly disgusting in some way.
Yeah.
But not a disaster. Not sort of sort of Twin Dilemma level sort of catastrophe.
Middling.
Nor is it obviously great or indeed good. So, and from what I could gather of the critical consensus, I would sort of sit myself at the more negative end of that.
Yep.
I feel it sort of gets by on it ends so beautifully.
Yeah.
With the departure of Sarah Jane, and with such a rug pull that the Doctor could be that mean and untrustworthy. That's obviously very interesting. I read somewhere that at least part of that departure scene was kind of improvised or something. So
yeah, I think it was rewritten or sort of worked up between Tom Baker, Elizabeth Sladen, and Robert Holmes,
right?
Rather than being written by Bob Baker and
which
Dave Martin.
which would make sense
Yeah.
because it's the kind of connective tissue part of the story rather than the story.
Yeah,
but it's very touching. It's beautifully played by both of them. It touches on that otherness of the Doctor, which although obviously the Tom Baker Doctor is eccentric, he's kind of lovable and friendly, and John Pertwee's Doctor was also very kind of human, and that otherness returns big style in that last bit, and so you're sort of left with a nice taste in the mouth of it being interesting.
And they give that scene space to breathe a bit.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like the actual action in episode 4 wraps up after about 15 minutes, and it gives you about sort of 10 minutes to stay in that final space, which they often, I mean, it's not... I mean, the previous companion departure that we've seen is Joe Grant in The Green Death in this, where obviously it's like basically written in from the very first episode of that story. And this doesn't feel, I mean, they sort of set up the whole South Croydon thing in episode 1. This feels more like a sort of coda to the story rather than something that feels an inevitable consequence of the action. But yeah, the fact that it's not just a sort of tacked on, oh yeah, I'm going now, or I want to leave, or something like that, that they do allow that scene a little space to breathe.
Well, it's funny because I made a note that her protest that she wants to go and just needs a bath and hates it, and there's your bloody sonic screwdriver. I made a note. This doesn't feel very, very real. Like this is all very sudden and of course it's not. It's just it's her. She wants to be told, no, of course, stay, please stay. Oh, it's heartbreaking. But I don't want that to colour my view of the serial, which was Drek. And just because this bit landed so well, it kind of leaves you with a nice taste. But actually the story is dreadful. It doesn't really know what to do. It's trying to be a contemporary Earth story, but I mean, you just sort of feel, right, okay, well, There's the jets bombing something.
Yeah.
There's the kind of big industrial space, some great location work, a great set, control room. Where's Unit?
Yeah.
You sort of feel like, where's
I think
Unit?
they were meant to be in this.
Oh, really?
At one point, the Brigadier was going to get killed off during this, as in a sort of dramatic moment. But
I'm glad he wasn't. But you realise,
I do wonder if in this era, where at any point where you see military hardware, whether or not at least a provisional call was put into Nick Courtney.
I mean, but I wonder the degree to which it was a conscious decision, because you've got. Obviously, the Pertwee era is the Unit era, and there's a bit of that with obviously starting with Robot and working through. And we reviewed recently the Android Invasion, where there's the Unit but not the Brigadier. And I know there was a casting issue there; it would have been the Brigadier, but for him not being in rep in Coventry or something. But it feels like bit by bit. So they've taken away the Pertwee Doctor. Taking away the Brigadier, you get fewer Unit stories, and then it's like this is a story without Unit at all, and then you get very few contemporary Earth stories ever again, basically. Yeah. So it does feel like, is that a deliberate flex?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's like you definitely. I mean, there was obviously an effort to keep Unit around. I think at least a bit more, and a bit more than they were actually able to during the Tom Baker era. I sort of slightly feel as well, maybe what you're sort of getting at is that the sort of Bob Baker and Dave Martin vibe feels very sort of Pertwee coded, doesn't it? The sort of nuclear base, the military hardware, the sort of big energy project or something, which is something that the Hinchcliffe era does less and less of. And then by the time obviously we get into the second half of the Tom Baker run with Graham Williams, it's like it's gone completely. You sort of, it's almost like a sort of, I do know what you mean about like as a sort of an attempt to sing the tunes a little bit of an earlier era, but it just doesn't feel it doesn't feel the same.
But it also was there. I mean, I don't know, was there a decision to sort of progressively pull away thread by thread? Because like you got fewer Unit stories, then Unit gets a bit recast. I think you're right. It's interesting that they sort of phase it into the background rather than it just being like Tom Baker reset. We're not doing this anymore, kind of thing. And so maybe over a kind of season or a couple of seasons, that makes sense. But to come into maybe that makes sense. I don't know. But to come into this, it just felt like there wasn't it felt like it was telling a story with a part missing, and the part, because the formula is so dialed in with Unit. And I feel that Unit also provides in this type of story a necessary sort of dramatic foil for the Doctor in being able to explain stuff, being constantly confronted with a different and by definition militaristic solution, which he's trying to bat away. You can imagine Pertwee say, "You fools! What do you think? You think your weapons will achieve here?" Whereas here, actually, with both what's his name, with both Dr. Carter,
in the earlier
episode, the hospital pathologist, and Professor Watson, he's sort of faced with broadly open-minded, scientifically minded blokes with a kind of with less knowledge but a broadly similar outlook. I mean, they accept all this stuff. They kind of wince a bit and go, really? But then when faced with the evidence,
they go with it.
Sure. Yeah, it's a very scientific method. And that doesn't really create a dramatic tension for the Doctor to explain his worldview or defend his worldview or whatever. It just feels very empty, I felt, this one. What did you think?
I quite like this, actually. I definitely like it more than you. I think I don't disagree with what you're saying completely. I mean, I think if the main problem with it is that I think it never quite coheres into, or what it becomes is slightly less than the sum of its parts, I think.
Yes.
I think there's a ton of interesting bits in it, and I think there's a ton of good bits. There's loads of good stuff in this, and there's loads of interesting stuff. And I always think, in a way, it's sort of it's the kind of story that we kind of think of when we think of Bob Baker and Dave Martin, right? Who, whenever we've encountered their stuff before, and I always come back to like the Claws of Axos, for example, as being like something that feels like pretty Route One, nailed on Earth Doctor Who run around, but with loads of sort of interesting ideas tossed into the mix, which makes it a bit more interesting than the sort of standard Doctor Who procedural.
But this doesn't have a tramp with a bicycle or anything, right?
No, it doesn't have any of that. I think you're right that it lacks in places a sort of certain charm, maybe. I don't know, actually. I don't know. I mean, I think to list off some of the stuff that I think is good. I mean,
well, this would be fun.
All of the stuff where I think like the stuff all around the nuclear base, I sort of quite like. They make great use of that location. It looks brilliant.
I agree.
It's very also on location when they go like handheld with the sort of 16mm film camera and shoot everything. Like even just someone like Dr. Carter driving his car, they shoot from a very low angle. They go handheld and sort of wobbly cam when Sarah's wandering around zapping security guards with the alien ring. All of that looks great. But even within those scenes, I think, and I agree that maybe there's the sort of perhaps a bit less dramatic friction than you might like. But at the same time, I think a little more time is given to characterising both Dr. Carter and Professor Watson than the sort of stock figures that we might always necessarily see.
I mean, to the extent that I was really sad when Dr. Carter copped it.
Yeah. It's quite a shocking term because he's a very likable guy, and obviously he gets on very well with the Doctor. And so, you know, as a sort of duo, you go like, oh, this is quite a nice dynamic. But the fact
and
that
also there's a you think he's been killed by Sarah Jane when the ring is first used.
Yeah.
And then when he recovers, you go, oh, thank God. And then they kill him.
Yeah. Well, and there's a few switcheroos like that because also like, you know, we spend a lot more time with Professor Watson than you would sort of necessarily expect for, you know, someone whose job is, you know, like we've seen that character archetype.
I know where you're going with this.
The scene where he rings his family to say goodbye is like really well handled, I think, and it's sort of heartbreaking the fact that he knows it's all going to go down professionally. And then, you know, so he rings and he doesn't want to let on to his wife that you know, anything.
Yeah, very stiff upper lip.
Yeah, but very tender and very emotional. And then you're so relieved when it doesn't happen, you know.
Yeah.
But then there's also a few beats where you think, oh no, it is going to go down. Like this is the day where she's like Mrs. Carter at home or whatever.
I couldn't bear
Mrs.
it.
Watson at home is going to.
Yeah, I couldn't bear it when he kissed the kids goodnight for me. I was like, oh, come on. I knew he had to survive. He just had to.
And I'm not used to Doctor Who, you know, perhaps of this era, sort of pulling those emotional heartstrings.
And
it
left some space for that as well. It's not like it's hello dear, I'll be late. No, everything's all right, and it cuts away. Like they linger on that scene. It's a long scene.
But likewise, later, when the action sort of moves to Castria, where the Doctor and Sarah take the female version of Eldrad off to the planet, and then we're basically done with the nuclear research plant, there's also a slightly longer than we need scene, like in a good way, where like you're just left with Professor Watson almost just kind of going, what the fuck do I do next?
I did
that
laugh.
whole scene where he's going like, oh, what am I going to tell him? No one's going to believe me. And he's sitting there in the wreckage of it all going like, all right, the next bit's going to be really hard.
Yeah, and I did laugh at his final line of course there'll be an inquiry. It's just like a judge-led inquiry. Ed Miliband would be delighted.
So there's all that stuff like that. And so I think a lot of the characters are not being taken for granted. And I think there's also, even, you know, with Eldrad, the villain here, you know, who's sort of grown out of this.
So good they cast Eldrad twice.
Well, yeah, and this is a sort of interesting thing as well, that it's like, as you pointed out, there's the whole sort of twisty-turny sort of, is Eldrad a villain or are they a sympathetic person deserving of the Doctor's help? And I think the script plays that, and everyone involved, including, what's the name? Is it Judith Judith Paris
Yeah.
as the female Eldrad, who I think is great.
Yeah, she's
really good.
I mean, she's far the superior of the Eldrads.
Yeah. Well, we'll get to that. I've got a thought on that, but
Although go on. Sorry.
there's I mean, really striking bit of design and appearance.
Oh,
and
if you wanted, if you put into Chat GPT, give me a picture that represents the connective tissue between glam rock and new romanticism.
yeah.
That pretty much that would come up.
It's a great get up and really well thought out again, because obviously, supposedly she's grown out this sort of rock formation and all of that. And so, it's a great get up, great performance. And the performances, the sort of three-way shifting of trust between her and the Doctor and Sarah, really well written, really well played. I also think, and I don't want to make too much of this, but obviously one of the plot points hinges on the fact that sort of Eldrad turns from being a female character into a male character.
Yeah.
And, in terms of the way that we sort of think about, or in terms of the way that...
Played by Stephen Thorne.
Stephen Thorne, of course, who played Omega and the voice of Izar. Basically anyone you need to turn up, like in the Daemons, anyone you need to turn up and shout, Stephen Thorne turns up and shouts.
And boy does... Yeah.
I mean, obviously, sort of gender is sort of a bit of a hot button political issue at the moment, and particularly the sort of outpouring of bigotry that we've seen over the last few years towards the transgender community. And I think when you see Doctor Who sort of at least nudging into those ideas, you're sort of inclined to look for sort of commentary or anything. And I don't.
Well, it's really irrelevant to Eldrad.
Well,
isn't it? Like
the transition of gender is irrelevant to Eldrad. And I don't think it's very much rooted in the idea of a gender binary. And I don't think there's really sort of, it's more just a sort of dramatic beat that, Eldrad was a woman, and is now a man. So I don't think there's anything to necessarily read there. But I do think there's almost there is a sort of sly comment on masculinity, I think, which is quite interesting, that Eldrad as a woman is effective, conniving, a really sort of powerful villain. And as soon as he becomes a man,
he's a buffoon,
shouty, blusterous buffoon who is dispatched. And this is the thing, I think there has been a lot of commentary over how being dispatched by tripping over the Doctor's scarf is a lame way out.
I mean, you get that. You get to do that once.
You get to do that once. And I think in the case, it's like the Stephen Thorne version of Eldrad is just an over-the-top buffoonish dick who is dispatched relatively quickly as well, within a sort of about 15 minutes of his first appearance. Without...
I just love the sick burn of, we would rather the planet died entirely than risk having our descendants have to deal with you.
I mean, it's such a flex.
But again, I agree with everything you said, and yet at the same time, I just feel this was so empty.
Well, that's the thing. I think what it doesn't do is sort of cohere into something that really pulls you along, or even, I think, leaves that much of an impression in terms of a story or an adventure. I think frequently throughout the story, I thought there was something reasonably engaging or interesting happening on the screen, whether that was a visual, whether that was a performance, whether that was an interesting sort of dialogue. I think it's a collection of good scenes. There's something, and I can't quite put my finger on it, because frankly, I've seen Doctor Who procedurals that have far less going on than this.
Yeah.
But yeah, it just never quite coheres into anything. Well, either the amount or I've garbled this, but anyway, it's slightly less than the sum of its parts.
I got I think it was really quite a lot less than the sum of its parts, and some of those parts were great. I did feel like there were some, like, I mean, there are just some stupid bits, right? Yeah. So I mean, I
really?
realize that in military terms it is a thing.
Yeah.
So I know that it is a thing. I don't want some devotee of Professor Lawrence Freeman to write in and say, no, actually, I realise they are a thing,
I mean, do write in. We like the correspondence. Yeah.
but I realise they are a thing, but it never fails to make me laugh, the concept of a tactical nuclear weapon. It's sort of tactical diarrhea, it's sort of like, I don't know, it just seems, it always makes me laugh. And the idea that they could sort of, we've only got 10 minutes, let's just sort of run down the road and hide behind a truck. It's
well, there's also, I mean, but again,
and also just like the fact that the director of the nuclear plant could pick up the phone and go, yes, we'd like you to nuke. Yes, we'd like you to nuke the nuclear plant.
Yeah.
No, I realise that, yes, but
although he does make a point that it's like, yeah, they were quite eager to get over and do it. There is that scene where he says to the doctor, like, yeah, I think maybe they just want to deploy this stuff or whatever.
Yeah, no,
but
they're mad keen for it. But the point is that, like, it
doesn't quite ring true.
No, I mean, no. I insofar as I was able to suspend my disbelief watching this, that took me. I mean, I like a nuclear weapon dropped on a nuclear power station in mainland UK.
Yeah.
It's just such a stupid idea that I mean, I know that they probably wanted to sort of make fun of the kind of that militaristic way of thinking, but it doesn't work.
No.
The Driscoll, so Driscoll is one of the minions.
He's one of the technicians.
One of the technicians, yeah. One of the chaps in white coats who mills about the nuclear power station looking important and
one of the less memorable characters, I think, in this.
Yeah. So and dispensable and indeed dispensed with.
Yeah.
But the stuff where they drop the ring, he picks up the ring, then there's the ring, and it's sort of like a science fiction farce. It's like farce without the comedy, and it just sort of feels a bit interminable. Episode 2 sort of runs on the spot for a bit. It just sort of goes a bit.
Do you know what? I put episode 2 quite repetitive in that literally it's just cycling through the same set of beats a couple of times. So possession, going into the nuclear core, get them out, lose the ring, find the ring, possession, going into the nuclear core.
Yeah, exactly. It spins its wheels.
Yeah.
And I felt so. Episode 1, okay, like the creepy when Sarah Jane is trapped under the rocks and reaches out and you see the hand and you think, is that a hand? Oh my god, it is. Of course, this is the hand.
Yeah. And it's in the title.
But it is really creepy as fuck.
Yeah.
And
when it comes to life at the end,
I love that.
That's a great effect as well. I sort of couldn't quite work out how they did it. Yeah.
But yeah, it's creepy and scaly and horrible and a bit weird.
A bit wet looking.
Yeah, and
that nice Tupperware box that they move it around.
Yeah, I know, right? So, but I still felt that this was sort of, and there are some good lines, like a wonderful close up on the Doctor in episode 1 where it was inert, completely dead. Dr. Carter's inert, yes, dead, maybe not. And it, that's a nice sort of little bit of kind of a Hammer-esque half of a second there. There's sort of lots to like, and yet I just, as you said, I feel it didn't cohere into. There wasn't a dramatic through line. This isn't really about anything.
No.
And it goes very core, corridor, control room, corridor, core in episode 2. Episode 3 introduces the moral ambiguity around Eldrad and obviously, is it Judith Paris?
Yes.
Yeah. Who, the ambiguity and the sort of ambivalence around her character is interesting. And then by episode 4, it sort of just,
Well, I think weirdly,
out.
particularly because they're leaving space in episode 4 for that departure scene, it almost feels like the sort of RTD conclusion that we've referred to a few times, where it's like, well, let's get this wrapped up because we got something good that you're going to like. Sort of,
we've got something
along
else.
the way. I would say though, by the way, on your point on episode 3, that I think it's a measure, and I think you're right that it is just sort of cycling through set pieces, sometimes several times. But again, something that I do rate about it or like about it is that it is finding little twists to make that a bit more interesting than it needs to be. So like I think it's a measure of the fact that the cliffhanger to episode 3 is they're on Castria. Eldrad sort of opens the door and immediately it gets shot by an arrow.
Oh yeah, that's a good.
And it's also like, but
I was watching it in a cafe with my headphones on. I was like, oh fuck.
But it's also a measure of like how they've done the sort of twists and turns to get you to that point where the person who is essentially being coded as the villain for most of the story getting shot is itself a shocking reveal. It's like to make you, and also to be fair, I mean, yes, it's I think as you were saying when we did the Crusade a while ago, it's very much at the sort of time the sound effect just right and then turn around with the arrow sort of sticking out of you, but very effectively
when it's
directed,
done well, as
it happens so quickly.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like it's very impactful.
Yeah, and it's very clever as well of the writers here to, but because then it leads you to question for what would have been a whole week. So who is on the planet? Who are the descendants 150 million years later of the kind of Eldrad era Castrians? As it turns out, they're not. But it leaves you wondering that. So there is some skill, but it just this isn't about anything. And I think Barry Letts would never have let a story not be about something. And this isn't about anything. It's a sci-fi story. It makes some, there's some interesting stuff thrown at the screen, but it doesn't really cohere, as you said, and I found that more annoying than you did.
Well, I would also say it also doesn't get off to a brilliant start. I mean, it's like, and this might be something that we talk about later, actually. It's like, I think that, Doctor Who episode 1s are always about like sort of establishing a killer setup. And this, I think, takes a while to get you into the story. I think the first scene, which is obviously about the sort of banishment and the order of the obliteration of Eldrad escaping Castria, is borderline incomprehensible. Like, I hadn't got a clue what was going on with those creatures with sort of duvets over their heads.
They looked cold.
I mean, yeah, and sort of falling over. And I sort of had, I mean, obviously, you can look back at it, it's almost so incoherent. And I think this might be sort of getting to the point that you were making about where the unit characters are slightly more useful for this kind of story than just staffing it with scientific characters. Like, there's a lot of like geology chat in it. There's a lot of talk about like silicon and like the molecular structure of rock and things like that, especially in episode 1.
Well, this is science fiction, Matthew.
I
know. This is science fiction. We're taking it very seriously.
Geological science fiction. It's the genre that we all dreamed of. So I think
certainly
it's like,
moved along at a geological pace.
Very good. But I think it takes a while to get to the point, or it takes slightly longer than it needs to when people are then wandering around zapping each other in the nuclear power plant, which is like where I start feeling like it starts to get cooking a bit. Also, to be fair, on Dr. Carter's death, which, as you say, I was quite sad when he bought it because it was quite fun. But that's a great stunt because presumably they had someone on location in whatever that plant that they were filming is, falling several stories from that platform. No, I mean, the location stuff is great.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like, I think we're sort of saying the same things about this, but drawing different conclusions in a way. But it's like, I felt like I wasn't underserved of interesting stuff, but I can't quite put my finger on why it didn't cohere, or rather, what more I would have wanted from it. And I think maybe it is just, as you say, like sort of a theme, some sort of takeaway, maybe, other than that was a good bunch of twists and turns.
I don't think that I think that the best, let's see if we can nail this. The best Doctor Who stories give the Doctor agency.
Yeah.
And the Doctor he provides Eldrad with a lift, trips him up at the end, but there isn't
You're
really...
right, it largely plays out.
It doesn't dramatically force the Doctor, if I touch these 2 wires together, it doesn't really force the Doctor into any dramatic tension that reveals his morality, or will we get a discussion from him about the different choices, or there isn't really a great Doctor moment.
No, you're right. And it's actually once it gets to Castria, which is where the story's meant to start cooking, really. I mean, it's all been predetermined in a way. It's slightly, there's a touch, I mean, it's not exactly the same mechanic, but there's a touch of I went back in time and bribed the architect in a way, with all of those sort of twists that the Castrians are doing on each other. And to be fair, even then, it's not short of good stuff. Like the scene where the recording of Rokon, what presumably like millions of years after the species has been completely obliterated. But taunting,
does his mic drop, basically.
Yeah, when he says, "I salute you from the dead, hail Eldrad, king of nothing." And it's like, that's such a good line. And it's so well delivered. But yeah, you're right. It's like the Doctor's sort of just there going, "Oh, fucking hell." It's like
awkward.
Yeah, awkward. But then, speaking of awkward, or at least things that the Doctor has to do, let's talk a bit more about the finale scene, which, like you say, you said earlier, obviously, it's like the best thing in it.
Gallifrey.
Yeah, I think it's... I went on the same journey with it that you did, obviously, where Sarah announces that she's completely fed up and everything. You just sort of think, oh, this is coming slightly out of left field. It's a bit like when sort of Tegan rather rapidly decides that she's had enough at the end of Resurrection of the Daleks. It's things like this is coming from nowhere. But what it actually reminded me of, and it was sort of looking forward a bit to a later sort of companion departure scene, it felt in the same ballpark as at the end of Series 8, the first Capaldi series, where supposedly the Doctor and Clara are both going their separate ways. And the the Capaldi Doctor, particularly in that series, sort of coded as more of a sort of distant, emotionally sort of unavailable kind of guy, a dick, if you will. And they're having this conversation where they're sort of grappling with their feelings of sadness, but neither of them able to say something directly. So yeah, and again, the sort of twisty-turny dynamic plays itself out very well. That Sarah's having a strop and just wants some attention, but she doesn't mean that she's going to leave. The Doctor hasn't been paying attention to her at all, and then, he's just been trying to fix the TARDIS, then gets the recall to Gallifrey and decides he has to jettison her. And then she comes back in and says she doesn't mean it, but he says he's going to kick her out. And then there's just this wounded, and it's like, Tom Baker plays it so well because, like you say, he's more of a... He plays the Doctor as, like, simultaneously distant. Like an enjoyable enough person to be around, but also sort of quite distant and emotionally unavailable.
Yeah.
And it's not like the sort of when Joe Grant leaves at the end of Green Death, where the emotion of that is just painted all over. There's absolutely no ambiguity about what he's feeling, and he's not even really trying to hide it in those circumstances as well. He's absolutely broken.
Yeah.
And that's such a beautiful scene. But in this one, it's like, it's almost like, and he's kind of playing with his hat a bit as well. He just kind of emotionally retreats into himself and almost like can't really say anything. He doesn't really have any speech or anything to say to her when he realizes that they're going to go, when she's going to go, and he's going to have to let her go. And it's really heartbreaking.
Tennant steals that wholesale when he's in his Doctor, like the kind of pursed lips, like, oh, yeah, okay. Whenever he's doing goodbyes, it feels like a just complete lift of this. Obviously, by the time of like Journey's End, when he's learned,
I can only think of the Tennant goodbyes where it's like extended crying.
No. But if you look at
I was going to say what?
But if you look at the earlier ones and when he's trying to sort of say goodbye and like I was thinking as well about like his emotional unavailability during Fires of Pompeii, when like Donna is pleading with him and he retreats completely.
Yeah.
And that kind of pursed lip retreat, it's very reminiscent of this. The Doctor is made unreliable in this moment, and that's what makes it far and away the most interesting
Yeah.
part of it. You are pleading with them not to part from one another's company, and yet they do.
Especially because I think it's one of the most successful pairings. Tom Baker and Elizabeth Sladen of just like having these two characters just as mates. And there's no point really in any of their stories where you're ever thinking, I mean, she obviously rattles off a list of grievances, but you've never previously ever thought, why are these people hanging out together? They've always had that sort of best mates kind of vibe in the way that Tennant and Tate do so well much later on. And so, suddenly it's almost like suddenly they kind of have to have the conversation about what their relationship is as it's all sort of coming apart, and neither of them can quite meet the moment, the Doctor particularly, in terms of just having anything to say of substance in that moment. And it's beautiful. It's really well done.
For this project, first you'll need Elmer's glue and a paintbrush. Cover your hand with Elmer's glue. You'll need to apply 5 coats, drying each coat in between with a hairdryer. Once the glue is dry, then you will need some type of powder, whether it be baby powder, any kind of powder. Apply it all over your hand. Slowly start to remove the glue. As you remove, add more powder. This is a great little project, very cheap. I don't think there's a way you could make a hand any cheaper than Elmer's glue and cotton and a little paint. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you do, subscribe to my channel and check out my other Halloween videos.
So, John, you've, I think, as we've been sort of talking about at the end of every episode for a couple of months now, you're manning the social medias, and you've moved us. We are now very active on Blue Sky.
Primarily.
But if you want to get in touch with via social media, that's the way to get in touch. But anyway, we were delighted to get some correspondence from new follower, new listener, High Heat Stats. Hello.
Hi.
Heat.
But we were delighted.
We were delighted. I mean, partly also shout out because it's not something that I ever talk about on this show, but I'm a big MLB fan here for my sins, and a Mets fan, which I'm sure is not going to win me any favours.
To be clear, so highheatstats.bsky.social, high heat stats, MLB stats, and baseball analysis. So
with the side order of Doctor Who chats. So
yes,
very much our kind of correspondence.
In your wheelhouse,
so thank you very much,
Matt.
But anyway, High Heat Stats had some interesting things to say, I thought, about our review of the Android invasion. And we got into a bit of discussion about that story's flaws. But there was one message that we wanted to pick out. John, if you care to do the honours.
Yeah, so the message from High Heat Stats ran thus. How's this for a hot take? Android invasion is a great 1-episode story. Like, pretend that it's that's all it is, and the cliffhanger is the end of the story. Not a satisfying ending, but extremely watchable time and again. And actually, this is something that was picked up as well by Martin, long-time listener to the show. Hi, Martin. MJPO007 on Blue Sky. Android invasion, eh? Episode 1 is excellent with a fantastic cliffhanger. After that, it seems unsure where to go next. Shame, really, as there's potentially a lot to love. Perhaps a case of great idea, poor execution, or only enough for 2 episodes. So, sort of similar point made there.
Well, it's almost the sort of inverse of also what we've just been saying, or what I was just saying about The Hand of Fear, where I was saying it's quite slow to get started and sort of cooks reasonably productively around the middle. But I do think this is a massive archetype of Doctor Who story, which is like basically like the great episode 1 story that basically just like the air goes out of it as it goes on. And I think how this occurs is no mystery really, because it happens where a writer has come up with a great idea for a story, but sort of stumbles at the narrative. And when you think that, like, so much, especially in classic Doctor Who, 25-minute episodes, the first part of a story, it does, a good job of laying the table, basically. But the meal in episodes 2, 3, and 4 is sort of quite boring and unsatisfying.
The proof of the pudding
is in
how it concludes. But yes,
whether or not they wrap it up by episode 4.
Basically, right?
Yeah, print that.
Yeah, I mean, I
So
think,
go on. Great episode 1 stories.
I mean, I feel like, a couple spring to mind. One of which is a kind of real answer, one is a bit of a cheat. But
Go on.
Sound of Drums and Last of the Time Lords. I mean, Last of the Time Lords is widely and I think correctly derided as a terrible denouement to that. And especially because, Utopia is the kind of prequel to that two-parter is astonishing. So you get Utopia and then you get Sound of Drums, and it seems like it's really cooking. And And unfortunately, the bigger the bigger the fantastic, it's directly proportional to how amazing episode 1 is, or the setup is, how good the the conclusion then needs to be. And with the setup of Sound of Drums, it's very disappointing how the kind of the balloon bursts and then farts around the room.
I think you're bang on with this, and I would go so far as to say also I think basically you could extend that to most RTD, to finale
Series
two-parters are a great part 1 and a disappointing part 2.
Yeah.
Which I think, and it's something, I mean, this is sort of not quite related to sort of what I was saying about the classic series, but I also think it's a function. We always celebrate the cliffhanger in Doctor Who, but the problems that it imposes on narrative are huge. In that basically, I mean, as many classic series writers have said in interviews, it's like having to bring everything to a sort of blood-curdling sort of climax every 25 minutes is...
Conjures an image?
If I did retakes, John, I'd use a different turn of phrase, but we're keeping it. When that turns up in the Apple transcript.
Blood-curdling.
But having to reach that kind of crescendo every 25 minutes, and I think it's... I think it's more pronounced.
Not
as
at
well
our age.
It's more pronounced in the series finales that you get in the new series, where it's like if you've got a 90-minute story, you basically spend 45 minutes. All right.
Sorry, no.
Listeners, you know where I'm going with this.
Sorry.
Go on, give me a cheat answer. Or was that your cheat answer?
No. That was a cheap answer. My cheat answer is the 11th Hour.
Okay.
In the sense that it is an episode 1, but it's an episode 1 not of a story, but of an entire era.
Do you know what? That lays the table beautifully for the era. Do you know what? You could also I'd also say I'd add the Woman Who Fell to Earth on that, which is like a less good story than the 11th Hour by some margin, but it's still setting up a world.
But I still feel the 11th Hour set up basically a concept for the Doctor that they never revisited ever again, about his sort of hyper awareness and his. I mean, I think a lot of it is to do with as you have. I mean, this is your big thesis, and I completely agree with it. But like, they just weren't writing to the performance yet. There wasn't that guitar too near the amp feedback-esque kind of the performance, the writing, the performance, the writing, the performance. So it was...
They had to write something.
Yeah, and then he acted it and put something onto it. But there was something about the Doctor's manipulation and bravado and hyper-awareness, and it was just fresh. And then it quickly just becomes a kind of box of quirks.
Curdles, yeah. Give a few examples from the classic series. I mean, I think Enlightenment that we talked about.
Oh God, yeah, we talked about recently.
Yeah, we talked about that very recently.
I think episode 1 is great.
It's a really good episode 1 that I think the air goes out of it. I think fairly rapidly once you get into the series.
Incidentally, we should mark the passing of Barbara Clegg, because obviously we recorded the episode before she passed away. So
Yeah, well, I think we actually had a fair amount good to say about the script on that one, even if we did.
Yeah, no, I felt very strongly that
I did go back and check to say, is this massively insensitive to put this out, and concluded, no, I think we were
But
fair.
I think certainly what was good about it was her.
Yes, I
And
would agree with
I
that.
strongly suspect that the curatoric
Also,
aspects
a few other
of it.
people had their input. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, but I think episode 1 is extremely strong, and especially the kind of reveal that the ships are in space. It's beautifully done. Even like it looks great. It's so odd. It's so weird. It's so other. It's so other, and the setup is so good. And the wind does go out of its sails after that. Basically.
Very good. I was also messaging a friend of the show, James Kettle, about this, and we agreed. I suggested like the faceless ones being a good example of a story where it's like it's so odd and uncanny, and that airport setting is so brilliant in episode 1. And then he pointed out actually like almost all the Troughton stories you could describe this as, especially when it gets into the whole sort of, I mean, Tomb of the Cybermen, great example, super atmospheric episode 1, and then once the Cybermen get defrosted, they just sort of go in and out the tombs a bit. All of the base under siege, it's like, you know, the setup is like what base and who is besieging it, and usually the Cybermen, and then there's that. I mean, even to an extent, although I mean, the Mind Robber, you could say, I mean, the Mind Robber never gets better than the psychedelically batshit episode 1. But I would also say that like the other 4 episodes of that are still pretty weird. So it's like it's not the case that it straightens its tie too much. Yeah, but no, this has been an interesting sort of new train of thought for me. But like, yeah, the great episode 1 in the mediocre story. Listeners, viewers, I'm sure you are thinking of plenty more that we've missed here. So please get in touch and tell us what they are.
Yes, please do.
All the usual channels. I mean, as you can tell, we do correspond with people on Blue Sky. So Blue Sky, I'll explain later. Search for us there. Email hello@I'llExplainLater.com.
I'll explain it.
We're getting some nice comments below the line on YouTube. Keep those coming. It's always nice to get a little notification.
They are only
saying
nice
something
because Matt moderates them. So
no, genuinely.
the wild
everyone's
invective has
super
been
lovely.
deleted.
I enjoyed the comment that we got the other day. I'm so sorry that I don't have the user's name to hand, but it was someone who got in touch to tell us that they thought that James Corden actually peaked in the Lodger, which I wasn't entirely sure if I agreed with, but I loved it as a claim of like that. I'm delighted that is someone's opinion.
When is the Lodger? 2011?
I mean, he probably did peak around that time.
Is that 2010, 2011?
Yeah, 2010.
2010.
It's the right era.
Yeah, like we're in what series 2 or 3 of Gavin and Stacey.
I would definitely agree he peaked at the time.
Yeah.
So anyway, look, plenty of ways to get in touch with us. Please do, and of course, send this episode to a friend if you've enjoyed it. Tell them about the podcast. Leave us a preferably 5-star review wherever you're finding this. Leave us a rating. You know, open the window right now and yell out. Tell the person sitting next to you on the train while you're listening to this what a brilliant Doctor Who podcast you're listening to. And we will be back next week for another conversation about Doctor Who. But in the meantime, thanks a lot. Have a brilliant week.
Goodbye.